About 9 months ago, this video by a channel named What, Why, How came across my radar, and it was a response to Lavader, a YouTuber I actually enjoy watching quite a bit. It was specifically a response to a video he did entitled 5 Misconceptions About Monarchy. I watched the response and let's just say it left something to be desired. So in this video, I'm going to walk through all the different problems I saw with this video, defend Lavader a bit, and respond to many of the arguments that What, Why, How makes in this video. And just for further reference, I will be referring to him in the second person going on in the video. So with that, let's dive into.
There is a worrying trend these days. People who unironically believe we should have a king. Not just a ceremonial monarch who waves his staff around and sits still for weird paintings, but a legitimate king with actual legitimate powers. Now, this is not a major trend, especially not in the United States of America, but in the Western world, including Europe, this strange fringe of the far right is growing steadily in prominence.
Yes, we're off to a great start. Now, this is a clear case of poisoning the well, because whether he means far right in the solely political sense or not, when people hear far right they think of Hitler, Mussolini and so on and so forth. Whether this was done on purpose or not, it's still something which is somewhat slimy and should be pointed out as a case of poisoning the well, which biases viewers against a certain position right as they are about to hear the information or arguments for that position.
One channel that fits this description is Lavader, who as far as I can tell isn't a bad guy at all, he just is wrong about monarchy. So today how about we look at a video by Lavader, the largest monarchist YouTube channel. Let's do a good faith analysis of his arguments, let's look at them honestly, and show exactly why they're wrong. And for his fans, who are probably typing furious comments down below, if you want to have a good understanding of the world, you have to open your ears to opinions that might disagree with you.
I find this particularly ironic, because whenever someone gives a good faith critique of democracy, showing how giving the masses more power leads to just as much tyranny as totalizing power around one individual, people like this will dogmatically defend the democratic system with its numerous faults, because an uneducated, ill-informed propagandized mass never tyrannized anyone, right?
I don't expect to convince you, but I hope you finish the video with at least an understanding of the weaknesses of monarchy as a political system. In this video, I'm not going to be arguing the UK or any other European democracy should abolish their ceremonial monarchies. I don't really care. If I see any comments about the Netherlands or Norway, thank you for leaving a free comment and promoting the video without even watching it. No, I'm arguing that giving actual political power to a king, which Lavader wants to do, is a bad idea. Kings can be fun, they can be cool in movies, but I don't want a hereditary dynast to determine how much tax the government takes out of my paycheck or whether or not my country should go to war.
So, let me get this straight. You're not fine with the hereditary dynast deciding how much to tax you or sending your children or you out to war with, in many cases, their own children, but you're fine with a bunch of faceless ivory tower politicians backed by lobbyists, corpos, and non-government organizations taxing you and sending you or your children out to war over, in many cases, frivolous matters, all the while using all sorts of legal loopholes to prevent their children from going to war. And all of this is fine because, hey, at least we voted for it, guys. And before you say, well, I want a democracy without those things, I'm sorry to inform you, those are not bugs. They are features of the current system.
And you shouldn't either. You and I, as full-grown adult human beings, deserve to have a say in those things by voting for our leaders. If you already agree with me, then great. Take these arguments, and if you ever see someone claiming monarchy should be applied to your country, you can use these arguments against them. This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video's about. Let's talk about Lavader. This fella is a national conservative Bosnian. Now right off the bat you might be thinking of a certain interwar ideological strain, but Lavader is strongly committed to opposing the F word. So what does Lavader believe? Well, he wants what he describes as a semi-constitutional monarchy, one where the king doesn't have absolute power, but significant power. So somewhere between Britain and Saudi Arabia, or judging from his videos and tweets, the German Empire. For clarity, the Kaiser in the German imperial constitution had greater powers than the United States president does in the American Constitution, since the German legislature had no power to check the emperor or his executive branch. And of course, the German Kaiser obviously wasn't elected, but inherited the position and held it for life. Unlike the last few debunk videos I've done, Lavader doesn't want blood to run through the streets of New York City. He just has weird ideas that need a good response, since more and more people support them. Let's chat about Lavader's video, Refuting Misconceptions about Monarchism. After some introductory chatting, Lavader addresses the first of these misconceptions that he wants to talk about.
Without further ado, let's address our very first myth about monarchism. We will start off with perhaps the most famous claim about monarchism, and that monarchism is just too expensive. Why should we pay money to one man who can then choose to spend it on whatever he wants? Now, not only is the claim that all tax money goes to the monarch completely false, but also that it doesn't really work that way, and it's not as black and white as it may seem. Let's take the United Kingdom as an example. Currently, the government pays around £100 million each year to maintain the royal family, which means that an average British citizen pays the royal family around £4.5 each year through taxes, which is certainly not a lot.
Okay, so I'm just gonna pause right there. He goes on to point out that the British royals actually rake in more pounds than they burn. This is actually debatable since there's extra expenses beyond, but there's also extra income from tourism. On the other hand, the Palace of Versailles, built by the French kings, does get plenty of tourism too, and France got rid of their monarch 150 years ago, so maybe you can still get tourists to visit your country without paying for King Charles to get pedicures. But you know what, I'm wasting my breath because this whole conversation is stupid. Lavader is dragging the British monarch, whose chief power is attracting tourism, into the entire political category of monarchism, and pretending the budget complaints about the milquetoast ceremonial costumed British kings are the same complaints people make about actual powerful monarchs like the corrupt king of Saudi Arabia. If I were to make a list of criticisms for powerful kings, the expenses are like the 20th worst part. Again, Lavader thinks kings should have actual political power, making the whole first section of your video on why this form of government is good, about how the British royals actually produce a profit in a democracy, is an act of argumentative laundering.
Well, yes, Lavader brings this up because it is a concern about monarchy that some have espoused, particularly British Republicans. As you said, it is one of the lower ranking factors when overall considering monarchy. However, its importance in the discussion is increased because it is one of the easiest and most levied arguments against monarchy, increasing its needs to be addressed. Honestly, you could have just saved myself, yourself, and everyone watching this video time by just ignoring this section of the video. It really didn't need to be addressed if you really thought it was some inconsequential argument compared to the larger problem of, oh my gosh, Lavader wants a king to have political power.
Under monarchies, the monarch has to think in terms of his or her lifespan. If he taxes the nation into poverty in just a couple years, he'll become destitute. If he wants to pass the estate to his children, he needs to have a long-time preference, because they are like owners of property. Since the state is theirs, they don't want to damage it and are encouraged to tax the minimum needed to achieve his desired living standards/goals, and then leave the rest of the economy to maximize its growth, so they can work on long-time projects that will affect positively the nation and don't cause problems for when their children will rule.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. If what he's saying is true, then there wouldn't ever be inflation or high taxes or debt in kingdoms, right? Since monarchs must act responsibly, right? Can you think of any example of a monarchy going into debt? I can. Kingdoms faced plenty of economic troubles throughout history. The most famous revolution that toppled a king, the French Revolution, was a direct response to the drastic financial situation the kings of France dragged their kingdom into.
What? What? Do you think that the existence of debt, inflation, or high taxes is solely because a country's leader or monarch is responsible? Yes, Lavader did make the point that a monarch has to be responsible when taxing the nation so as to not tax it into oblivion and only enough to maintain himself. However, the existence of high taxes, inflation, or debt does not mean that a leader is necessarily responsible, even in a democratic or republican sense. And I would disagree with Lavater if this was the point he was making. As a response, I would say, though, that while the existence of debt, high taxes, or inflation does not prove a leader or king irresponsible, the reason for which these things come into existence, or the length for which these problems are allowed to fester or stay unaddressed, would more so be a determiner for whether the monarch is irresponsible or not. Additionally, the original point I think Lavater is getting at is not that unjust or high taxation will never happen under monarchy, but that it would be less likely. To use Lavater's business analogy, if I owned a business and I wanted to pass it on to my kids, it doesn't mean that I would never make mistakes or put the company in debt. Just that I would be less likely to take frivolous actions or engage in frivolous actions that would cause that in comparison to a random employee who doesn't own the company and who could just leave and go to another one if this one fails.
You can read more about this in the French Revolution and Economic Interpretation, which I linked below, but any academic history you'd read about that revolution would cover this. I'm pretty sure I learned this in elementary school. The Kingdom of France spent billions funding adventurous foreign wars, including the American Revolution. While great for us Americans, this drove their kingdom into debt. But this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. The worsening financial situation of France didn't start in the late 1700s, but in the late 1600s. King Louis XIV waged 3 major land wars against his enemies on the continent for very little gains. Now make a note that this so-called Sun King ruled France for 72 years. We'll come back to that. Anyways, in order to pay for a century of bloodshed, the kings of France imposed taxes not on the aristocratic rich nobles that benefited the most from the wars and held the most personal wealth, but commoners like you and me and Lavader too. French kings, rather than challenge the power of the aristocracy, imposed new taxes on salt, created new domestic tolls across France, and so on. These taxes strangled the class of people in France that actually produced things of worth, the commoners, because the privileged nobility was literally excused from paying the tax. So when a bad agricultural harvest happened in the year 1789, farmers still had to pay their taxes, which meant the price of food spiked. That year, the King of France at last gathered representatives of the different classes together to address the dire financial situation. From there, everything spiraled, and the rest is history.
Okay, so you say the reason the French Revolution happened is due to the irresponsibility of the monarch, and that's a fair argument until you realize that one example of an irresponsible monarch does not debunk Lavater's claim. His is a generalized one. In general, the system of monarchy incentivizes more responsible leaders. You pointing to irresponsible monarchs does not debunk the claim. If I say being from Africa means you're going to have brown eyes and you show me a blue-eyed African, it doesn't debunk my claim because it was a generalization of the population, not a specific statement about which amount of the population had brown eyes. To sufficiently debunk this claim, you would need to look at a selection of monarchs from history and look at which monarchs were greatly irresponsible and compare that to the greater selection of monarchs. Additionally, he went on to say that the French Revolution was further caused due to the king preferring to tax the commoners and not the aristocrats, when that is false. Louis XVI did want to tax the aristocrats, contrary to popular belief, and Louis did try to tax the aristocrats. For someone who claims to know so much and who learnt it in school, you seem to have missed this. Louis XIV, or the Sun King himself, was not opposed to taxing the aristocrats. However, he did not want to fall under their influence, and knowing that he could rule more freely and without constraints if he did not tax the aristocrats or the first and second estates, he was kind of deadlocked into taxing the commoners by them. It was only under the stress of the wars he waged that he was able to tax the first and second estates. I would agree that starting wars, especially those with little gain, is irresponsible. However, the claim you make here is false. Both Louis XIV and XV were willing to tax the aristocrats and were trying to do so, offering some concessions in order to get them to agree to pay taxes. However, the concessions were so numerous that the tax reforms were made useless. Even Louis XVI, the king at the time of the French Revolution faced the same problems trying to get the nobles to pay, but ultimately having to back down due to the power the nobles had. The French Revolution ultimately is more the fault of the French aristocracy, aka the First and Second Estates, than it is the fault of the monarchy. While yes, the irresponsibility of King Louis XIV when it came to him aiding the independence of the American colonies and the other wars he waged lies on him, more blame lies at the feet of the First and Second Estates, who deadlocked the three Louis, consistently limiting them and getting in their way whenever they tried to properly address the problem.
So believe it or not, in real life, we have several kings of one of the most powerful countries in Europe acting extremely irresponsibly for personal glory, draining the treasury of funds, then imposing huge taxes on regular people to pay for all of it. That's what caused the French Revolution. Now, is financial crisis unique to 1700s France? Of course not. Plenty of other kingdoms suffer from them. Just Google any revolution or civil war in a kingdom and poor fiscal policy is a likely culprit. Is financial crisis unique to monarchies? No, republics can have them too. Lavader's argument, however, is that none of this happens in monarchies, generally speaking, because they are just inherently more responsible.
Wrong!
That is not the argument that Lavader's making. While Lavader might do better to argue or phrase his arguments more clearly, what Lavader is more so arguing is that the structure of monarchy is more conducive to our better incentivizes responsible leaders.
Don't buy it. You can't just rely on vibes and vague fantasies of personal responsibility to make an argument about political systems. Where is the data? All the most successful, happiest, most stable countries in the world today are democracies, some of which have ceremonial monarchies, of course, but those have no power. There's a reason for this.
This is a ridiculous claim. The idea that monarchy is bad because democratic countries have higher levels of happiness and economic and human development is quite frankly laughable. These countries are like this in spite of them being democracies, not because of it. Democracy may have an impact on the improvement of human development, but it's simply a correlation. Human economic and social development can happen in spite of whether a country is a monarchy or democracy, and oftentimes this development is more hinging on other factors like what philosophies, ideologies, or religion the society believes in. The Human Development Index which you use first and foremost is a creation of the Western world, which means the factors it values are in line with those that the Western political philosophies prioritize, like level of education, income, equality, and so on. Obviously, if you apply this Western standard to a country where Western ideas have no foothold, the results are going to be different than Western countries. What this further shows is that democracy or its results are not the causal factor for this happiness, but that it is just a correlate. The HDI, or Human Development Index, is a Western metric for success. Countries where Western political philosophies have more of a foothold tend to be more successful. Modern democracy comes from the Western political thought, therefore democracy is correlated with a high HDI level. And I must say, while you ask monarchists for data, most of the data you've presented so far is extremely faulty.
Anyways, monarchists, where is your data? I will believe you if you show me a large research project that compares a large sample of democracies and powerful monarchies in similar circumstances to see which had superior fiscal policy. None of you will, though, because your ideology is not based on data, but instead a rebellious fantasy. It doesn't help your argument either when you can't cite any successful powerful monarchy today besides Saudi Arabia and Jordan, two American colonies, since all your favorite monarchies collapsed into chaos when they threw Europe into bloody war 100 years ago. Where's the personal responsibility there?
And here we have a case of more reductionist history by what, why, how. Boiling down the conflict of World War I to just a bunch of monarchies plunging Europe into bloody war. Let's just completely ignore any influence that the citizenry and the rampant nationalism among them across most, if not all, of Europe played. Let's ignore that it was at the behest of the citizens that many of these countries actually engaged in the war, and if these countries were democracies or republics, the same thing would happen. This is another tactic you constantly use, which is to frame historical events through the lens of monarchy bad because bad things happen under monarchies, even if they are more important component factors as to why these things happen. Even as a republic, France still engaged in frivolous warfare on the mainland and in her colonies over more land, just as the monarchy did.
Monarchists need to read more history.
I think you are the one who needs to read more history, and not just read it, but understand it.
But you know what? Let's keep watching, and maybe some of you monarchists watching will learn more history.
No democratic leader owns their society, and so has no incentive to think beyond the next election. And this is why politicians are so negligent with spending, inflation, debt, and unlike a king and his heirs, democratic leaders don't have to deal with the consequences of their actions, so to maximize their impact, they begin to spend as much money as quickly as possible before their term expires, thus destroying the whole nation.
I feel like Lavader gets his talking points from 1789. Democratically elected leaders don't just immediately steal money from the treasury and run wild. You need taxes or loans to pay for government programs, and as the United States shows, plenty of democratically elected leaders are reluctant to raise taxes or borrow money because we the people don't like it when they do that. There's a reason why the US budget, while ginormous, isn't a quadrillion dollars. Anyways, remember when I told you to make a note of something? King Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled France for 72 years. Well, you know what, he technically ruled for 64 years. Since his first decade on the throne he was a child, but you get the point. Despite having the scepter for more years than many people live, he still dragged France into debt. He didn't have to worry about re-election, he wasn't in office for just a few years, but he still left a major problem for his 5-year-old grandson who inherited the throne. Oh, by the way, that grandson, King Louis XV, dragged France further into debt with foreign wars. Plenty of kings have acted irresponsibly throughout history. That's because for true powerful kings, there are very few limits on their power. They can drag their kingdoms into prolonged duress, unwilling to exit to serve their own personal self-gain, while a democratically elected leader would sooner or later be voted out of office, ending that duress. Here's some proof. This is a chart of American soldiers in Iraq. President George Bush, America's very own Sun King, brought the US into massive, expensive wars. In 2008, the American people, sick of the war, voted into office Barack Obama, who pulled out of Iraq. A similar story played out in Afghanistan. That is the power of democracy. If we the people care enough about an issue, we can change what our government does. That's a good thing. But imagine this. If George Bush was president for life, or King of America, well then we may still have 100,000 soldiers in Iraq. Unlike what Lavader says, democratically elected leaders actually do have to deal with the consequences of their actions. They can be voted out of power, or in George Bush's case his party, and a new guy can be brought in to fix the mess of the last person. For monarchies, you have to wait until the king dies, or if there's a revolution, and King W is looking pretty healthy to me.
Alright, see this is another problem I have with this video, where you seem to be bouncing around. Sometimes you're criticizing monarchy as a whole, other times it seems like you're more critiquing absolutism, which is not what Lavader is in favor of, and only sometimes you seem to be critiquing semi-constitutionalism. But I digress. The reason why this point falls flat is that in a semi-constitutional monarchy where power is shared between the elected representatives in the government and head of state, both parties exist to advise the other party on what is best, so that if the monarch was like George W. and in favor of endless wars, the Prime Minister or Chancellor exists as a representative of the populace to discuss why the public is or is not in favor of such with the monarch, and to get him to dissuade from his original plan or to come to a sort of compromise. Additionally, the Constitution could be written so that in those particular cases the military can't be mobilized unless there is an agreement between the head of state and government. There are so many different ways to prevent said situations in a constitutional monarchical structure.
Let's move on.
This is probably one of the most popular arguments against a monarchy. Why should someone, by virtue of being born to the right parents, have the right to exert power, whether absolute or not, over anyone else? I want to answer this with one simple question. Is there a completely fair way for someone to get into a high position of power, no matter the means? Why should someone who said the right kind of words to the right kind of people hold power over the entire nation? And not to mention the numerous ways these people get into positions of power in a republic. And I am not just talking about votes. Just because someone, for example, became president of a democratic nation through seemingly democratic means, doesn't mean that they got that position 100% fairly. Think about all the times these people used corruption to their advantage, how they can be greedy, and just how many times they lied to the very people that got them into power. But sure, it is more fair just because more people approve of them.
This is such an incredibly weak argument. Are all elections in republics fair?
Well, to start, I would say that most are not fair, considering in most republics you have the political aristocracy and the elites rigging the system so that candidates that they prefer get into power. But hey, moving on.
No, as Lavader says, politicians can cheat and lie. But even if 1% of elections are fair, that's better than a monarchy where you have a 0% say in who the king is. He's literally criticizing democracies for being too close to monarchies, then saying that makes monarchies better. Which is it? At least medieval monarchies had the balls to say God gave them the right to rule.
Saying that if 1% of elections were unfair, it would still be fairer than monarchy has a big glaring problem. And it has to do with the definition of fair, which according to Merriam-Webster is in a manner that is honest or impartial or that conforms to rules in a fair manner. Which means saying that a monarchy is unfair because it doesn't play by the rules of liberal democracy at all, while a corrupt democracy that is fair 1% of the times is fairer, is quite frankly a load of poppycock. You can't compare two different political systems with two different standards or fairness and then say one isn't fair based on the other standards. To put it simply, you can't use the rules of field hockey to say that a person playing football and kicking the ball is unfair. If you want to judge these two systems, you would need to come up with an objective criteria of fairness, justify it, and then you can argue that one is fairer than the other.
Also, Lavader does this thing where he confuses what fair means. When a politician cheats in democracy, it's unfair because they're twisting the rules. They're violating our right to have a say in who leads us. When a king inherits the throne, not on the basis of any actual personal merit, but just on his blood, nobody's twisting the rules. It's unfair because it's unjust. The rule book itself is rotten. A king should not have power because we, the people, those who make up this country, who have the inherent right to have a say in how our government is organized, did not give him that power.
Lavader is criticizing democracy for being unfair most of the time by its own rules, and saying because monarchy follows its own rules more, it is better. Yes, he's saying that corrupt democracies are behaving like monarchies, and the reason why that is bad is because, by democracy's own rules, a society which acts like a monarchy is bad. In other words, if I was promised a luxurious beachfront house, but I got a tiny home 20 meters from the beach, that would be worse than if I was promised a tiny crumbling shack in the woods and got a tiny crumbling shack in the woods. Lavader is pointing out that the reality in democratic systems are far away from what the system promised. To expand upon my earlier point, I'll reveal another reason why this argument is hogwash, and it is because when he says the whole rulebook is rotten and the whole system is unjust, he's presupposing liberal democratic values, which, like I said earlier, he would have to justify in order to make this point. But alas, he fails to do so. Instead, all he does is make empty appeals to the people's intrinsic right to, quote-unquote, have a say, which he also fails to justify. Where does this right come from? Does it come from the government? In that case, they can just take it away. Does it come from nature? Well, on a secularist worldview, nature has no brain, no conscience. It is more of a random force, so it can't give you rights. Or do these rights come from a greater intelligent being, a creator, like the American Constitution appeals to? In that case, the monarchist could simply also make that appeal, and here we have come full circle, right back to the idea of the divine right of kings. In all criteria which you could have proven that monarchy is unfair, you failed. All you've done is presuppose the liberal democratic values, which is the current status quo, which is fine, but you fail to justify why that should be the standard, and instead decided to make an empty appeal to the intrinsic right of the people to vote, failing to justify that as well.
A monarch, or specifically an heir, doesn't need to start a campaign, lie to his people, and use corruption because his position of power is already solidified from the very moment he or she exists in his mother's womb. In this case, all that needs to be done is to educate the young heir on how to run the nation as he gets older, and most of the time, monarchs who were educated from a young age on what to do and how to run the nation when they get into power have a higher possibility of being better rulers than a president who got into office from absolutely no previous experience or knowledge on what to do in that position.
This is an argument I've seen a lot, and it is a bad one. Yes, in well-off countries, the heir to the throne does receive a pretty good education, because why not? His family is wealthy enough that even if they didn't have a crown, he'd go to a good university at least.
I have a deep love for Africa.
But guess what? The same is true for most elected leaders, because you have to be smart and competent to get elected for the most part. What special esoteric training did King Charles get that any other well-educated politician, many of whom are law school graduates, historians, or experts in business or other fields, did not get over the course of their life? Not only that, but every US president except for one had experience serving in government or the military, which is the best training you can get, by the way, to, serve in the government or command the military. Joe Biden spent nearly 40 years in the Senate and 8 years as vice president.
I don't really have much to say on this point because Whitehouse brings up some good points. However, what I will say is that the form of education that the heir gets is different to the type a Democratic leader would get. Democratic leaders more so tend to get more theoretical education when doing subjects like law, economics, political science, etc. In the case of an heir, in a monarchy, he gets both theoretical and first-hand experience in education pertaining to statecraft. Many times, kings will give their sons some political power, like giving them free reign over an earldom, or allowing them to do certain actions like negotiate trade deals and the like, to demonstrate to them the advantages or disadvantages of their actions, giving them a better grasp of the situation they are in. The types of education are completely different in nature, for the most part. Hell, he even understands this and points out that many former US presidents also tended to spend long periods of time in government. But it's not necessary for you to do that and become president. So I think he inadvertently proved Lavader's point correct.
Unless you want your semi-constitutional monarch to govern a state or serve in the legislature, then how could they get such important and relevant experience? There are exceptions, of course. You could vote into power a pretty dumb president. But guess what? There are dumb and incompetent monarchs too. Just look to Thailand or countless other examples of kings consumed by their own vices.
I also wanted to point out his criticism of Wilhelm II for not being a part of the army, as many US presidents have been. I know this is just a particular crack at Lavader, but taking crack shots at Lavader opens you up for shots as well. Even if Wilhelm didn't spend any time in the army, many monarchs around that time did, and historically, being a monarch meant you would be a leader on the battlefield, and this didn't stop until pretty recent in modern history. Following this, however, he just goes on another one of his "we can't vote a bad monarch out" shtick.
Next, Lavader says,
Also, it is important to say that having an heir makes politics and geopolitics much easier in that nation. You cannot rig whoever becomes the next monarch the same way one can rig an election, nor can you say for certain who will win the next election or elections afterwards, unlike in a monarchy where you can say with confidence exactly who will be in charge for the next couple of decades.
Yeah, this isn't how that works. Politics and diplomacy are not easier because you'll know who'll be in charge in 20 years, which, by the way, is the ultimate form of rigging the results, but whatever. Does the United States have an easier time, for example, negotiating with Putin because he won't leave office until he dies? No, in fact the opposite. Stubborn or delusional rulers for life, and that includes kings, can corrupt their country's domestic and international status irreversibly, and you can't get them off the throne except by violence. Here's a historical example for you. In the late 1800s, European empires loomed over Asia, strengthened by new technologies and hungry for conquest. But in China, Empress Dowager Cixi, the true power in the Qing dynasty, blocked modernization. By the time she died, it was too late for the reformers. China crumbled into civil war, economic domination by Europe, foreign invasion, and eventually the communist revolution too. If China could vote out its leaders back in the 1800s, that wouldn't have happened. So monarchs can be stubborn in the face of change. But when the monarch dies, sometimes at random you can get a completely new policy overnight. That sort of unpredictability is not good. Let's rewind to 1762 in the midst of the 7 Years' War. Prussia was on the verge of defeat, losing several battles to Austria and Russia. But the Russian Empress Elizabeth died, so the throne passed to her German-born nephew, who became Emperor Peter III. Rather than finish off Prussia and crush a major rival to Russian power, the new emperor, by many accounts a fairly hideous sort of person, decided instead to switch teams, join Prussia, and betray Austria, turning the tide of war and saving Prussia from certain destruction, wasting all the progress Russia had made. His motivation was purely personal. He liked Prussia. Before the end of the year, the extremely unpopular emperor was toppled in a coup by his own wife, Catherine. Could you imagine if something like that happened in America? If when FDR died in April 1945, the presidency passed to some random Roosevelt cousin who decided to switch teams to the Axis? For all the criticisms leveled against American foreign policy, that the country has multiple personality disorder, we haven't done anything as crazy as that.
Well, I agree. Knowing who the leader is going to be does not necessarily make leading a state easier. It does alleviate a good handful of problems. A knowledge of the heir could make things easier because there would be an understanding of his wants and desires, his temperament, attitudes, etc., which would make it easier for the head of government to work with him in a semi-constitutional monarchy. You know, the form of government that you're supposed to be criticizing. Goodness gracious, I've been constantly repeating myself. All the examples you bring up to show that people in government for long periods of time can get stubborn and stuck in their ways and cause serious damage or undo strategies years in the making are in absolutist monarchies. Qing Dynasty, absolutist. Imperial Russia, absolutist. Xi. Is almost as if semi-constitutionalism has strategies in place to mitigate problems like these that may arise.
Okay, but let's move on. He talks for a bit about the differences between a democracy and a republic. A democracy is a society where the people have a substantial say in their government, like by voting for representatives or directly for policies. America is a democracy, but it's also a republic. So what's a republic? Well, I'd say it's a representative democracy without a king, where people vote for a legislature and a chief executive. But monarchists like to play a rhetorical trick, where everything that doesn't have a crown is a republic. So not just the United States, but also undemocratic dictatorships like the Third Reich and Stalin's Soviet Union. I'll show you an example of Lavader making that argument later, but if you want to make that argument, you're just diluting a category so much that you won't be able to actually understand what the category means and how these governments actually work. Putting North Korea and France into the same bucket will confuse you, just as much as if I said all monarchs, including King Charles, are bad because Genghis Khan killed people.
That's not what he's doing here. He's trying to show that not all republics are democratic, neither do they necessarily have to be. In a recent video by Lavader, he gives his definition of a republic, a democracy, and the difference between the two.
At Xim the Despot 4673 for $5 asks, as a monarchist, do you believe there is a distinction between a republic and a democracy? Very interesting question. Yes, I do indeed believe that there is a distinction between the two, although at times it may be blurry. It all comes down to where does the government or head of state get his/her legitimacy from. For monarchy, it is through a hereditary bloodline and depending on what the succession laws are. Now here is where it gets interesting in regards to democracy and a republic. A republic is a system that gets its legitimacy from the people and claims to represent their will, while democracy is a system where people can elect their representatives and have a role in governance. Very peculiar distinction. A republic does not necessarily have to be a democracy. It just needs this sort of legitimacy that they are fighting for the interests of the people. Fascism and communism are prime examples of this. Both claim to embody the will of the people and the population and were mass movements, but they were skeptical of democracy. That is where they got their legitimacy from, by claiming to represent the will of the people and what was best for them. It doesn't mean that the people necessarily need to have a say in governance through elected officials or anything. And that is how democracy can work in monarchies. They still have the power of electing their figures and being represented, just not at the very top of the state, i.e. the king. So that is what I believe the distinction between a republic and a democracy is. A republic is a form of government that claims legitimacy through the will of the people and a mass movement, while a democracy is a system where the people can have a say in governance through electing their representatives or voting directly.
And here is a site which has a similar definition and makes the same differentiations. It's not just monarchies. Other people do draw a difference between a democracy, or in the case of what you have described, a representative democracy, and a republic, because there is a meaningful difference. Given this definition, while I wouldn't agree the Third Reich was a republic, Soviet Russia definitely was, as its governmental legitimacy or consent to rule was initially given by the people. I don't know how this is confusing.
If we look at the nations of Europe after the Age of Enlightenment, we will see that the majority of monarchs at the turn of the 20th century were constitutional and had a democratic system already in place, whereas when we look at republics from that point forward, we will find that republics were vastly more authoritarian than your average European monarchy. The truth is, democracy and republicanism are definitely not the same thing. A republic is not always a democracy, as history has shown us with countries like the USSR, Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic of Austria, and the list goes on.
Again, he's trying to stuff the Third Reich and Stalinist Russia into the same category as interwar France or even America to smear all republics as undemocratic or chaotic or whatever. Let me tell you a little secret. This whole video, my whole argument really, isn't actually about monarchy versus non-monarchy. I don't really care about that. Lavader wants a king with political power. That's not a democratic monarchy, it's an authoritarian monarchy, a powerful monarchy. My argument is actually about democracy versus authoritarianism. Democracy, we the people having a say in who leads us, is a superior form of government to the sort of monarchy that Lavader supports, where power is held by some guy who won the birth lottery. Everyone knows this except the monarchists, who want to dodge criticism by distracting us with Joseph Stalin. There's more about Stalin and other dictators at the end of the video, but
Dude, you're trying to stuff the German Empire and North Korea into the same category. You're one to talk, and Lavader is not trying to loop these together to show that all republics are bad or chaotic, but instead to show that republics are just susceptible as monarchies to dictatorial leaders, if not more. To address your other point about democracy versus authoritarianism, I know this is going to be a controversial, but authoritarianism isn't necessarily bad. The real structure that caused more problems was totalitarianism. The issue is that people use these terms interchangeably. While totalitarianism is a more strictly defined ideology with certain tenets, authoritarianism is much less strictly defined, and all the aspects of it which people reject are not inherent to it, but instead just one of the many actions someone in that position could take. Not all authoritarian regimes or leaders are bad, and neither is clamping down on some civil liberties in order to maintain order in a functioning society. Hell, while you make a big fuss about authoritarianism, when such authoritarian power is used by government to enforce adherence to democracy, you don't have a problem with it, you turn a blind eye to it, or simply don't recognize it as such because it supports your preferred worldview. Leaders like Nayib Bukele and Lee Kuan Yew are by definition authoritarian leaders, but their actions by and large have benefited their countries and its citizens better than a democracy would. You present democracy as the greatest political system, but fail to recognize that in many cases it allows for continued corruption. And I don't mean the type you can just vote out, because contrary to popular belief, you can't vote all the problems out of democracy, as voting can be the root cause of the problem in many cases. There's a reason many Greek philosophers like Socrates have written loads about how the system of democracy degenerates and destabilizes a society if not implemented properly. Socrates believed democracy should not be a right but a skill, one that you would have to prove by showing that you had thought deeply about the issue before getting the ability to vote. He basically saw it more as a civil duty compared to how we view it contemporarily. He believed in an intellectual democracy, not one by birthright, which is what we have today, saying that if just anyone had the quote unquote right to vote, then you would divorce wisdom from the act of voting. And it, that being our current system, has degenerated into what Greek philosophers predicted and feared most: demagoguery and majority rule, a system where politicians appeal to emotions and desires rather than logic or rationality. And like I have said earlier in the video, if you're going to make this appeal to the people's intrinsic right to vote, who leads them, you have to justify why they should have that right. If you sent a ship to sea, you wouldn't give just anyone an equal say as to how that ship is operated.
By definition, democracy is, quote, a system of government in which the people of a country can elect their representatives, and that is exactly how democracy works in monarchies. While the people cannot vote for the head of state, i.e. the king, they can still very much vote for their representatives, like the Prime Minister, members of parliament, and also the leaders of their local administration, and then these representatives will work alongside the king to ensure the stability of the country.
Very funny to say monarchies are democratic, people just can't vote for the king. Yeah, the king is kind of important, don't you think? If the king wasn't important, then why are you a monarchist? It is not a democracy if the people have absolutely zero say in a huge part of their government.
Yes, we know it's not a democracy, which is why he said that monarchies can be democratic, meaning the people do have a say in the operation of their government to some extent. And of course, we recognize the king is an important part of the system, because semi-constitutionalism recognizes the problem with both democracy and absolutist monarchy and uses a mixture of both to control and counteract each other. You obviously know the downsides of absolutism, because that's what you've basically been critiquing this whole time, and I've explained some of the many problems with democracy in my previous point. Semi-constitutionalists recognize this and formulate a system where power is split between head of state and head of government, and where they work with each other to pass laws for the country, but can counteract each other if either party wants to pass a policy which may be unpopular, bad, or harmful.
Okay, the next section of Lavader's video is responding to criticisms that monarchy is outdated. But guess what? You know what? I'm gonna be nice, because I have no response to this. Saying something is bad because it existed in the past is just as dumb as saying something is good because it existed in the past. And monarchists do that, by the way. They argue that monarchy is a natural form of government because we all instinctually understand having a big kahuna with a sparkly hat telling us all what to do. But there's plenty of stuff in nature and history that we all agree is bad, right? Having a powerful monarchy should be one of those things. Anyways, the last major section addresses corruption. He says,
Corruption is one of the biggest issues a government can face, and considering how much people talk about corrupt politicians and rulers, it's no surprise that many like to say that monarchy is a corrupt system in of itself. But it's clear that people don't really understand what corrupt means. Just because someone has political power and is wealthy does not make them inherently corrupt. Nevertheless, if we look at history, we'll find that there were indeed a few corrupt kings or emperors, but as I said, only a few. The reason being is that monarchs don't really have a reason to be corrupt. The main reason why people engage in corruption in the first place is because of two things: money and power. But monarchs are already covered with both of these things from the moment they are born to the moment they let out their last breath. And this is the reason why so many monarchs weren't corrupt, simply because they didn't need to engage in corruption. Now some may point to a few monarchs like King Louis XVI and Nicholas II, whose countries were embroiled in revolution due to their quote-unquote corruption of hosting parties and presumably not caring about the lower classes. But that isn't corruption, it's just negligence, and most people confuse acts of negligence for acts of corruption.
Okay, Lavader completely missed the point. He's so close to getting it, but he just doesn't. It's not just a few bad apples. Monarchy is peak corruption. Twisting public finances for your own private self-gain is the entire basis of monarchy. Every extraordinary palace, every fancy outfit, every expensive painting, every gold coin, just for being born with the last name of the last guy who won a war 250 years ago, is corrupt. Actually, it's not just corruption, it's rule by the sword. The strong eat and the weak are meat. Kings have no legitimacy, really, besides force.
I don't think you fundamentally understand monarchy. I think it was Curtis Yarvin who compared a monarchy to a business, and I'm quite fond of this comparison because I think it addresses some of the criticism and allows for better understanding of the functions of monarchy. But this idea that you present where the monarch is just using public money for personal means is faulty. A monarchy, in a sense, is like capitalism applied to the state. The monarch is the business owner, he provides a service. Taxes are the capital he gets for providing that service. And just like the owner of a business, he must delegate a section of that capital for himself while delegating the rest to improve his business, i.e. the state, and pay his employees, i.e. the members of his government. Looking at monarchy on this paradigm makes its process much more understandable and rational than looking at it on a liberal democratic paradigm. This paradigm also justifies succession, saying as if the kingdom is a family business, then the king as the owner has all right to pass it to whichever child he sees fit. So no, you getting the throne because your ancestor won a war some 250 years ago is not corrupt. In fact, I would say it is completely justified on this paradigm because not only are your ancestors the ones who started the kingdom, duchy, earldom, etc., they were the ones to make it flourish, and again, because it is a family business, they have the right to pass it on to you. Socialists have this weird saying where they say, oh well, you know how our government is a democracy? Well, we just want that, but on the business level. We want businesses to be democracies too. The monarchists are doing the opposite of that for all intents and purposes. To some extent, when you bitch and moan about how all monarchs are corrupt because they get money, palaces, paintings, and in general wealth, all because some monarch before them won some war, you've basically admitted to some extent that any wealth and somewhat successful family business is intrinsically corrupt, because why does the heir to the multi-million-dollar family business deserve to get all the wealth that he does simply because he was born to the right family and with the right last name? I should also address your comment about the idea that a monarch's only source of legitimacy is force. One, that's not true, but even if it was, so what? I think you should take a look into force doctrine. All of our government and society is held up and held together by force. Rights are not real, they're imaginary concepts that only exist in our brain, and the only way to actualize them and maintain them is through the enforcement by the state. Laws only work because the police use guns and weapons to enforce them. This idea that using force is this also horrible thing is so dumb.
Oh, also, even in ceremonial monarchies, the royal family tends to be pretty corrupt. King Juan Carlos of Spain literally resigned the throne because of a gigantic corruption scandal. That's not from the 1700s, that's from 2014. Same thing with other monarchies across the planet. Just look at the House of Saud. Next, Lavader says that republics have much worse corruption. Again, there's no proof or statistics for this, it's just vibes. He just thinks that's the case. Monarchists come back with actual proof. This only makes sense as an argument if you ignore the inherent corruption of monarchy as a system of government in the first place. In the end, if you want a less corrupt government, maybe there's a better way than appointing a hereditary monarch who is above the law.
He does know not all monarchs, even in quote-unquote absolute monarchies, are not above the law, right?
Maybe pass better laws or give corruption investigators greater authority. I don't know about you, but that seems to me like an easier, better solution. Anyways, let's see how he concludes his video.
As I have demonstrated, monarchism can be far more complicated than just a guy sitting in a castle with a lot of money. And people think that the position of a monarch is a privilege, but this assumption is far from right. Truth of the matter is, Being a king is one of the most difficult positions a man can find himself in. A king stands alone against all who wish harm upon his people. He, without a sense of safety, has to have the will and duty to fight against all the evil in the world. Think about this and all the burdens this man has to carry, the expectations he needs to meet, and the duty that he has. Think of all this next time you envy the position of a monarch. As Sir Fulke Greville stated, quote, "The greatest slave in a kingdom is generally the king of it." End quote.
Gosh, if it was really such a drag to be king, you think nobody would have fought any civil wars to claim any throne, would they? In fact, they'd be fighting civil wars to make sure the other guy got stuck with it. And it really sounds quite noble, the idea of a king standing alone against all the evil in the world. But in reality, kings, like any other politician, like any other human, are self-interested. They wanted and want to maximize their power, which is why kings feuded constantly with other politicians, nobles, in their countries, and with their neighbors abroad.
I guess we're scraping the bottom of the barrel here. While the reasons why one would fight wars to claim the throne despite the difficulty being king would present are numerous, a person can still fight to claim a position of power in a hierarchy despite the difficulty that comes with that position. For example, no one would disagree that generally being a boss or CEO is particularly difficult. Despite that, in a business, those eligible for the position will still compete amongst themselves for that position because they feel they are the most qualified individual. It's not just a will to power, it's a will to competency. The point Lavader is making about remembering that the position of a king is difficult next time you envy him is more so pointed at the average person who just sees the position as nothing but luxury, power, and wealth. Kinda like you. Whereas to those who are knowledgeable of the position and understand what it entails and who are more qualified may compete for the position because they may think that the other party is less prepared or inclined to take up that position. Yes, the rewards are great, but that is because the greatness of the reward matches the difficulty and importance of the job, like being a manager, boss, CEO, and so on and so forth.
Every single monarchist argument is based on an imaginary, uncorruptible, hypermasculine, giga-chad Christian patriot who'd go without rest to see their nation win. But guess what? Every king has been a human being. Every king has had flaws, some much more than others. Even if you get a king who is like 90% okay, which is rare, what's to say he won't have a rotten son? Conservatives, what if the king's a liberal hippie? Did you ever think about that?
Well, firstly, monarchists aren't conservatives. That refers to people who want to conserve the status quo. We're just generally right-wing. Secondly, yes, and I'm sure most monarchists have thought about this because it's a really easy question to answer once you have a knowledge of history and think for like more than 5 freaking seconds. If the king was a hippie and didn't take his position seriously, there's a whole system called the royal family, which could assert pressure on that individual either to take his role and do what is expected, which is in the Western context to showcase Christian values, or they could depose him or push abdication and replace him with a better alternative. Something we've seen multiple times in history. I must also note that the political climate we're in now is drastically different from those of previous ages where more violent force was needed. In the modern period, we can use more soft forms of force or power, which is why something like a deposed heir leaving, amassing an army and coming back to take back his crown is going to be highly unlikely.
What if the king dies when his son is an infant? History is full of kingdoms splitting apart into civil war over who should inherit the throne, or who should control little baby infant kings.
As for succession, this isn't a hard problem to face. All that is needed is some common sense succession laws, something that most kingdoms didn't have written on paper, which is what allowed for all of these wars and kingdom splits. If we wanted to avoid situations like Louis the Sun King, or Richard II, or Edward V, or Edward VI, we can make succession laws that detail what actions should be taken in the event of these certain situations happening. For example, we could make a law where if a king dies and is survived by his son and wife, the wife who was consort could be made regnant temporarily until the child is of age,
or of good enough education to take the reins. Or even better, the second in line, which would be the king's brother or sister, could be temporarily made regnant and rule until the child is of age and ready, which is what happened historically, like in the case of Richard II. However, we would put laws in place to ensure this is recognized as a temporary rule, which would prevent most of the problems that occurred historically, but that paired with my previous comment about the different political climate would be enough to reduce a lot of the problems that you are bringing up.
But anyways, let's take a moment to talk about the world's purest monarchy, North Korea. Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, inherited the throne from his father, Kim Jong-il, who inherited the throne from his father, Kim Il-sung, who was put into power by a foreign occupation and a civil war. Even though North Korea calls itself a democratic people's republic, if you actually believe North Korea is a democracy, you're delusional. So what is it? Well, you can make a pretty good argument it's a hereditary monarchy, but ultimately my point in this section is to point out the labels countries apply to themselves are just aesthetic. It doesn't matter if Kim Jong-un or any other dictator wears a crown, or a weird haircut, or a big fancy hat, whether they call themselves Kaiser, or Sultan, or King, or Raj, or President, or whatever. What matters is the actual extent and scope of their power. If you look at the material reality, these so-called semi-constitutional monarchies like the German Empire or modern-day Morocco and Jordan are fundamentally materially identical to any other authoritarian yet not absolute dictatorship of today or the past.
This is an extremely deceptive tactic you continuously use, which I've pointed out many times before. You constantly talk about how unfair semi-constitutional monarchies are, however all your examples of this tend to be Islamic regimes, which is to say, maybe just maybe, there are more important factors to be considered with the modern examples you brought up than the form of government. Like, I don't know, the fact that most of these societies follow some sort of Sharia law which value Islamic moral principles over individual freedom and liberty. Additionally, when we take a look at modern Europe, semi-constitutional monarchies like Liechtenstein or Monaco, the results are different, with the human development being quite high and most of them having a pretty good Gini coefficient. When we start looking for examples of these governments outside of Islamic territories, we see that they tend to have much better outcome, not because the system is bad, but because the values that the people and the systems uphold tend to be less oppressive. You again allude to the fact that the material reality in semi-constitutional monarchies are no different than those in authoritarian countries, and then you say that the semi-constitutional monarchies like the German Empire or modern Morocco or Jordan are no different than an authoritarian state, and I've already shown that premise to be faulty with my previous examples of Monaco and Liechtenstein, and I would agree. The fact is, monarchs to some extent are authoritarian rulers. However, the idea that simply being a type of authoritarian ruler or having authoritative power is bad is just faulty. To respond to this claim, as well as the title for certain political systems just coming down to aesthetics, which I may agree with generally, it doesn't particularly work in this situation. The relationship between a country's citizenry and their monarch is clearly different than that of citizens and an authoritarian dictator. Dictators often rule by fear, suppression, and might because their position as such is insecure, and their only source of legitimacy comes from the power they wield to suppress any opposition. In contrast, the monarch's legitimacy can and does have various sources, the most obvious of which is the idea that God gives the monarch legitimacy, like you mentioned. Another source of legitimacy is the formerly mentioned family business model, where the monarch has legitimacy because he is the most senior heir of the man or family which started the kingdom. Additionally, another source of legitimacy is the people. It is the case that many times in history, the people of a country are the ones who ask for their monarchy to be reinstated, viewing the existence of it as much more preferable than without, like England with Charles II or France with Louis XVIII. There are even cases where countries founded as republics eventually wanted to install a monarchy and invited certain foreign noblemen or princes to take the throne. Both then and now, the support of the citizenry for a monarchy and of that monarch is a source of legitimacy.
The same goes for absolute monarchies. There is very little difference in the level and extent of power between Mao or any other powerful Chinese emperor, or between Stalin and any other powerful Russian emperor. It's all authoritarianism, crown or no crown.
Like I said before, authoritarianism isn't necessarily bad. The government uses it all the time, specifically when it wants to enforce its preferred ideology or to preserve a status quo. Like the present Liberal Democratic one, even when the government enforces law, it utilizes authoritarianism. The difference is that you don't recognize such actions as authoritarianism because you are preferential towards them, which is fair. I will say again, what you're actually calling out is totalitarianism, the idea of surrounding all power to one individual, which I will point out again is not a key feature of monarchies in general, but is more so a feature of absolutism, which is not what Lavader is advocating for.
Now, I've been to Bosnia, I've even seen Alexander Crown Prince of Yugoslavia, but I'm not a Bosnian. Lavader has the right to argue Bosnia should have back its king, but he doesn't just talk about Bosnia. He talks in general terms about why monarchy is good. I don't think having a powerful king would be good for any country in the Western world. So with the video approaching its end, let's take a moment to talk about an alternative to powerful monarchies and dictatorships, the representative democracy. First, are you a sentient adult? Don't you have the right to have some say in whether or not your country goes to war or how much tax is taken out of your paycheck?
Another vague, empty appeal to my rights.
Well, guess what? I've got just the system of government for you, the representative democracy. What's that? You don't believe in human rights, even of your own? Okay.
I mean, you've still failed to justify them. I don't know what to tell you.
Well, how about this? As a sentient adult, you have some understanding of what sort of policies would be best for you, right? What about your adult family members or adult neighbors? They probably know basically what's good for themselves, right?
Okay, but what is the good? What moral or ethical worldview are we using to define the good? With the appeal you are making here, why can't I just define the good as whatever maximizes pleasure? And let's just say that maximizing pleasure for both men and women included allowing people to grow up another person if you find them attractive. If we put that into law, why would that be bad? You can't tell me that because all you do is just make vague appeals to the status quo without justifying anything.
Now imagine you wrote all of that knowledge down on a piece of paper and balanced it out, canceling negatives and positives. Well, on that paper would, more or less, be what is best for your neighborhood and your family as a whole. Now imagine you do that on a national scale. That piece of paper you end up with would basically say what is best for your country, which after all is made up of millions of individuals like yourself. That's what voting is. By everyone voting for a representative they think would best represent their interests, then sending them all to a big room, we can get a good sense of what sort of policies are best for the country, more or less.
This is such a childish view of democracy. For someone who talks about how monarchists paint an idealist picture of some Chad Christian king, you're doing the equivalent of that with democracy as we speak, where all the people are smart and know what is good for them and vote for representatives who will duly carry out their sacred duty with no outside influence other than their electors.
Now wait a moment, you might say. Lavader does believe in having a legislative branch, just the executive branch should be a monarchy. Well, why does the same principle of representation not apply to the executive branch? By all of us voting for a single executive leader, or in the case of a parliament, the legislature voting for a single executive, the prime minister, wouldn't that person represent what the majority of adult citizens think is in their self-interest more or less? Which, if we assume people aren't complete idiots, is actually the interest of the majority of the country, actually. But wait, you might say, people are complete idiots. They can be swayed by momentary trends, by clickbait news articles. Well, like I just said, people at least have a pretty good sense of what's best for themselves. And by everyone voting, we can figure out what's best for the country.
That's not how that works. What you think is best for yourself is going to be determined by what values you presuppose. When huge swaths of the population have different presuppositions about what good is, let alone what is good for them, problems are going to arise. It's not just about people being stupid, which I do think a lot of them are, but alternatively, it's that there are varying presuppositions held by different groups that are incompatible. And some of these philosophical presuppositions are going to be more correct than others. So this idealized view you have of democracy is very faulty. After this, he goes off on another rant, which I won't respond to since as the time of editing this video, it's over an hour long, so let's just jump into the conclusion. Ultimately, my point with this video wasn't necessarily to show that monarchy was a better system. I just have to make that clear because I know some people in the comments are going to point out that I did what I hope said I'd do as a monarchist and not bring statistics or data. No, the point of the video was to show that democracy, at best, is equal to monarchy, as well as defending Lavader and semi-constitutionalism as a position by showing how all the data that what Whitehall uses is either misinterpreted, has additional factors to be considered, or are just faulty. Because you can criticize others for not bringing data, but if all the data you bring is faulty, you're in no better position. Additionally, I wanted to show how philosophically he has no justification for why democracy is good or should be done other than vague appeals to my rights, which he also has not justified. Really and truly, to win this argument, I actually don't have to prove monarchy is better. All I have to do is prove that democracy is as good as monarchy, and at that point, all it comes down to is just what your preference is.